Hey everyone, and today we're going to be starting the game series in C++, and I'm so happy to be starting this because now I feel like we're at the point where we can actually start it because we've known stuff about the language, and if you're not familiar, if you haven't seen the lessons yet on the site, I'll also be making my own videos, but they'll be coming out at a slower rate, so I just recommend using the Google Classroom for that. But if you're watching this and you're not part of the Google Classroom, I'll also be making tutorial videos on some of the aspects. So be sure to watch those before you actually start the series because this is more of an intermediate series. I want to actually go into this where we know how to do stuff like logic, if statements, for loops, and stuff like that. But this series is really going to go under we're going to go through some advanced concepts and use the concepts we know and actually apply that in a game sense. And I also want to go through stuff like game design. Uh, so we're going to be using C++ and SDL2, and SDL2 basically is just a rendering API so that we can actually draw stuff to the screen that we want to. It's just a graphics library, essentially. So that's what we're going to be using to draw stuff onto the screen, and we're going to be using C++ as our language. So without further ado, let's get right into it. Okay, so right here, before we actually get into the code, I just want to actually go through what exactly we're doing. So we're making a game using C++ and SDL2. And here are the prerequisites that we're going to need to have / know. So first of all, the most important thing is, well, a compiler and IDE, and I would strongly recommend using not an online IDE. And the reason is because we're going to be actually installing SDL onto our computer, and it's pretty difficult to link to an online IDE. So I would just go with an IDE that you already have, and if you don't have an IDE and you're on Windows, I would recommend getting Visual Studio 2019. It's free to use and very easy to set up. Okay, now in terms of coding, what we're going to need to know is variables. So you're going to need to know how to create different types of variables. You're going to need to know logic, so if and else. Switch and case would also be nice, but if you don't know that, that's fine, because if you know if and else, it's very easy to understand what a switch statement is. Loops are definitely very important. We're going to definitely need to know what a while loop is and a for loop. And arrays are one thing that's important. Arrays, just a reminder, are containers of data. And the last thing that we need to know is what a function is and what a function does. Okay, so these are stuff that are helpful to know, but if you don't really know them, I'll also be explaining them as we go on. And I'll also make my own videos relatively soon on these topics too. So if you ever get stuck on one of them, you can go and watch them. So first thing is pointers. That's going to be one thing that would be very helpful to know for this series, but it's not required. Once again, if you don't know this, I will anytime I bring up a pointer or something, I'll sort of explain why we're making this a pointer and what it does. The next thing is classes and structures. That's something that would be very helpful, and I'm also going to be making a lesson on that. In fact, classes and structures is one of the more helpful things in this series, but I will be explaining them as we go on through the series. Next thing is the standard template library. Similar to like stuff like cout you might have used, where you put std, 2:, or as you say using namespace std, we're basically using stuff from that library that are template classes. Which brings me to the next thing, which is templates. And if you don't know what templates are, also don't worry. If you're looking at this and you don't know what any of them are, that's completely fine. We'll just go through them as we continue the series. Okay, now here are the stuff that are definitely not required. The reason I made this a separate slide is because anytime this comes up actually inside the series, I will directly explain what they are. Whereas with these ones, I'll just have like maybe I'll briefly talk about them or have a separate video on them. Whereas these ones, if we decide to come up with something like this, I will explain exactly what we're doing here and why. And the reason I say but helpful is because if you do know these, then it's obviously not a bad thing. So the first thing is polymorphism, specifically virtual functions and overriding those virtual functions. Next thing is macros, so your stuff like hash defines. Um, Data structures like a queue and a hash map, vectors, memory management, so the new and delete operators, stack versus heap, and smart pointers. Okay, so that's really all it is. If you don't understand anything from this slide, do not worry. Absolutely do not worry. These are just stuff that will be helpful if you already happen to know them. But if you don't worry. um, this is just something that I will bring up when we actually start to making your game. So now we have to install SDL 2.0, and there are different ways to do it depending on what you're using. So for Visual Studio, I've linked different sites for all the stuff. So this is how you can install it. So basically, what you want to do is, I'm actually going to run through it very quickly too. What you want to do is you actually want to go search up SDL2, and you just want to install it and then set it up. So I'm going to actually run through that right now. Okay, so how I got here is I just searched up SDL2 install, and it brought me to the most stable version. So now we see a lot of things, and this is what it's important, right? So what we actually want to do is ignore the source code. Source code is important, but in this case we don't really need the source code. Ignore the runtime binaries. What we actually want are the development libraries, because the development library, we're developing an application using SDL, right? And these links are going to change depending on what you're using. So if you're using Visual, it depends on, for Windows, it depends on the compiler you're using, right? So if you're using Visual Studio, you want to download this zip file. If you're using code blocks, you want to download this zip file, or any other IDE on Windows. If you're using Mac, you just want to download this one, and this is for Xcode when you're coding on there. And then for Linux, it's a bit of a different step to sort of do it, but you can also just on the SDL wiki search up how to do it and also use those sites that I linked. But for now, what we're going to do is we're going to download the zip file here, and yeah, I'm just going to put it in downloads here. And then what we want to do is that basically when you open this zip file, we're going to see a folder, and we want to extract this folder, right? And this folder contains a bunch of other folders. So it contains the docs, and the docs just contains a bunch of readmes, right? And readmes are just sort of like, they're not really licensing stuff, but they're stuff that are helpful for the user to know. The include is what the files we're actually going to be using. So these are all the files that are going to be included inside our source code. And you might notice that there's no .cpp files, or even it's just .h. And the reason is because the .c files are already built into these DLL files here, right? So a DLL file is similar to an application where when we actually build an application, we're compiling all the CPP files together, right? And the H files are just there to include. And what actually happens is when we include an H file, that H file just gets compiled into the C file, if that makes sense. So basically, that's why in the include file we don't have any .h files, but we actually do need the .c file, because most of the time the .c file will contain all our function definitions and all the actual compiled code. So that is why we have two folders for include and lib. And basically, in the code and the tutorials will show you how to basically set it up. And if you're having difficulties, then just let me know or write it in the comments, and then I can maybe send you another link or a video to help you out with that. But I'm going to show you here how to exactly do it into Visual Studio. So now let's get into code, and let's just open a simple window. Okay, so here I am in our Visual Studio project, and I've already configured this before, but I'll just run through what I did to really configure it. So on here in Visual Studios, you want to right click on this project file that got created for you, and you want to click properties right here. And then there are a few things here. So in the output and intermediate directory, you might notice you have different things. I changed mine because I like to sort of organize it. So what this actually does is your output directory is where your exe file gets placed, right? Your intermediate directory is where all the other necessary files get created, like .objs. Visual Studio will create paths for you by default, so if you want to go with that, that's completely fine. I prefer to do it like this, and it might look like a weird path. Basically, this just finds my solution directory, creates a folder called bin, and then it looks for the type of configuration it is. So there's debug and release. It looks for the platform, which is x86 or Win32 versus x64, and I'll place it in the project name folder. And I'm using C++17 here, but this will also work with C++14 and even C++11. And I'm building it as an application. This is very important. Do not build this as a DLL or a .lib file or anything like that. It needs to be an application, not a dynamic library, not a static library. Okay, so by the way, this tab won't pop up unless you've made a CPP file, so just make a CPP file called main. And now in C++, this tab should show up. And the thing that we need to do here is in additional include directories, we need to basically look for a SDL2 folder and include. So the reason I have it in solution directory is because if I open this in File Explorer, what I've actually done here is I've created a new folder called libs, and I've placed the SDL2 folder that we got from online into here. And this has the include and lib and stuff, right? Now you'll notice in my lib, I have a lot more maybe DLL files than you do, and the reason is because this is also using all the other DLL files, which we'll be installing as we need to, right? So basically there's other alternative SDL libraries we can use if we want to load images, load music, load text. Right now I have all of them in here, but you will only have you'll only have SDL2 lib and SDL2.dll, which is completely fine for now. And next episode we can talk about installing all these additional ones. So, but for the include, this is fine. You just want to look for your include file in your file explorer and just put it right here. Now in the linker, in general, for additional library directories, this is actually going to change depending on what platform you're on. If you're on x86, you want to look for the x86 folder. If you're on x64, you want to look for the x64 folder. And by the way, I just want to clarify that the x86 is what platform you're making it for, not what platform you're on. So don't just make it x64 because you're using 64-bit Windows. It's what you're developing for, and we're going to be developing for 32-bit because we just want to have the widest possible audience possible. In input here, I have a lot of stuff here, but what you want to do is you want to go to edit, and you want to add these two. You want to add SDL2.lib and SDLmain.lib, right? SDL2main.lib. And what that basically does is tell the compiler, hey, we're using these two libraries, so I want you to link with these two libraries. And then that's really it. So now, in here, we're going to do include, and if we write SDLH, yep, we get it right there, and we don't get any errors for that, right? So now let's go into our program here. Okay, so inside here, we actually want to put int argc and char double pointer argv, right? Basically, this is just for the Win32 API because SDL, you might notice that main here expands to SDL main. Basically, when we linked it with SDL main.lib, SDL2 creates its own entry point for the application. And the entry point for the application requires it to have these parameters. At the bottom here, we're just going to return 0. Okay, now let's actually create our window. So here's what we're going to do. We're going to create an SDL underscore, we're going to use this, make it a pointer. We're just going to call it window. We're going to call the function SDL underscore create window. Here, we can put in the parameters we want. And what it's going to do is it's going to create a window with the designated title, the X and Y position, the width and height. We're going to pass in the title. For now, I'm just going to call this app. We're going to pass in the X position. For now, we don't really care what the X position is, so we're going to use a macro called SDL window position undefined. This just means just place it wherever, right? What macros are is they just expand to some values. It's basically just a copy and paste. It's nothing really fancy. It's nothing really more than that. For the width, we're going to maintain a 16:9 aspect ratio, so we're going to make it 1280x720. For the flags for here, we're just going to make it 0 for now. But basically, flags are just extra things that we can tell the window to do. And what I'm also going to do is I'm going to create something called bool is running, just to tell that our thing is running, and then we're going to set it to equal to true because our program's running, right? What we're going to do here is while is running, what we want to do is just poll for events, right? Actually, let's just leave it at this now, and let's run the program. And now you can see here we actually have our window, but we're unable to do anything right now because we haven't actually registered any events yet, which is completely fine. In fact, the X button won't even work, but we've created our window, and yeah, that's really all to it. So we haven't really done much yet in this window, But in the next episode, we'll actually continue and we'll actually make our core object class, which will control everything related to our game. Alright, so now, thank you guys for watching, and I'll see you in the next episode. Goodbye.